Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the 3D Printed Gamer, where I talk about things related to gaming and or 3D printing. And today I've got a couple of things in front of me that I've been working on. And the spinner logo has little to nothing to do with with gaming, but I sort of have this concept of turning my scooter into a scooter spinner, Blade Runner spinner. If you're not familiar, it's the name of the sort of brand name of the flying car from the movie Blade Runner, and the upcoming Blade Runner 2. So anyway, I cleaned this up and just did it. This would be like the logo on the side of the car. And so because I was thinking about the design and I found this and I printed it up just for fun because I was thinking, well, you know, if nothing else, I could put a little spinner logo on my scooter. So there it is in all its glory. This, I think I may have talked about this a while back. And this is a pistol from the game Halo. And this would have been the pistol used in like the first and or second game. And this is something that I printed up. I'm pretty sure I started printing this last summer. And I have this issue where I print something and I get really excited about it. And maybe I work on it for a little bit. And then I find something else that I'm excited about. And I print that and I work on that for a little while. And so I have all these little projects that are not completed. And I kind of went back to this one because it wasn't really that far from being done. And even now it is not done, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but it is really close and I'm super happy with how this has come out. And I figured I'd go ahead and share it in its like 80 to 90% completed form. And this part of it itself is done. There's really nothing else I'm going to do to this except maybe another little coat of rub and buff on the metal here and then seal that in because as I've been discovering with these black gloves, as I rub my hands on it, it shows up on the gloves. So this part got sealed. I was a little concerned about sealing it, that it was going to lose the really cool metal effect, but I have a nice varnish, and this is the Watercolors matte varnish, and I got a giant size bottle because I really like it. And what I like about this is that it says it's matte, but it's really just this side of being a semi-gloss. And for the most part, when I put this on my miniatures, they come out looking as if I didn't coat them at all. Like whatever glossiness was underlying the varnish, it still tends to show through. So like if it was a little glossy, maybe it's a little less glossy. If it was matte, maybe it's a little less matte. But unlike, say, for example, my Liquitex matte varnish, which makes everything super flat, the Watercolors matte varnish does not. So for something like this, that's perfect because I wanted to maintain its kind of natural sheen that it had, and it's done that without making it glossy. That was the other thing. I didn't want to make it glossy. Now the glossiness on the handle comes from me essentially just polishing up the plastic with a bit of paper towel or kitchen roll, as you might call it if you're in the UK. And you can take this, in fact, this isn't even painted with paint. This is just my standard Stynylrez primer. And all I do is just rub it down, and eventually, because this stuff, it does have some abrasive quality to it, but it is such a fine abrasive that it really acts like a polish. So yeah, so that it ends up looking like plastic, which I really like because that gives it kind of a realistic feel to the whole thing. So there's that. The other thing I've been working on, the thing I've been printing, and I spent a lot of time printing over the last week or so, it was my daughter designed her own sleep dart gun, and it's for one of the characters from Overwatch, and I don't remember which one because I don't play Overwatch and I don't really care that much. But I was excited by the fact that this was her first 3D design project, and she was very excited to see it being printed out. And I don't have those pieces handy. She has them somewhere, so I'm not going to share those today. But one of the things she needs to do next, and one of the things I need to do next on this project is really going to be the subject, the primary subject of this video, and that is how do you take the final printed piece, which has all these crazy striations on it, and turn it into the smooth prettiness that you see here. And so we're going to talk about that. So this is, the reason this isn't done is because I had been working on this, and this actually, this piece fits up here, and then it locks in, and that's kind of the final piece. It's like a laser sight. Anyway, so I had printed out this piece to go on there, not realizing that there was another piece that made this, you know, one solid piece. But because I wasn't really paying close attention when I printed everything out, and this didn't get downloaded from Thingiverse with all the rest, I missed it. And it wasn't until I was showing the nearly completed piece to my daughter, and she looked at it and went, that doesn't look right. And I looked at it and I went, you're right, that doesn't look right. And I started looking around and realized that for some reason, when you download that entire batch of parts, this gets left out and you have to download it on its own from Thingiverse. So that meant I set this aside before finishing it off, printed this out, and then decided that I would wait to complete this so that I could do it on video and share it with you. But this also is for my daughter, who is getting ready to finish her first piece. So let's talk about sanding. All right, so the first thing, I've got a variety of sandpapers here. I've got 120, 220, and 320 grit. And for the most part, this is kind of all you need to finish this. You could start with a grit that is heavier than 120. You could have like a 100 or even an 80. And if I had one handy, and I don't, but if I had one handy, I'd show it to you. I feel like 80 is just a little bit, well, not even a little bit. I think it's a fair amount too much. To start with, that the etching that it does on the piece is at least as bad as the existing surface issues. So a 100 would probably be okay. I tend to just start with a 120. Now, the other thing is, for something like this has got a lot of flat surfaces, and if you were to just sand it by hand, what's going to happen is your fingers are going to push into certain areas a little harder than on other areas, and you're not going to get an even sand. So what you really want is a sanding block, and a sanding block can kind of be anything. This is an old piece that I printed that I'm not really using for anything. I did this, you might remember, I did it for a review a while back. But the nice thing about it is that, you know, this surface is completely flat. It's a nice size. It fits in my hand well. It also has some an edge here that might be useful depending on what I'm sanding. But all I'm going to do is take my sandpaper and wrap it around my block. And then when I'm sanding, it's going to sand it evenly, and I know that it's going to sand it evenly. On each of those flat sides. Now then, the other thing is, so let's say you have like a smaller area to sand and this isn't going to be useful and it's too big. You know, you can use, again, you can use anything. You know, here's a little popsicle stick. You could even glue this to a popsicle stick and make your own little emery board, and that'll get into pretty fine areas. I've used essentially anything that's handy. Oh, look, here's this base that I'm not currently using for anything. I'll stick that on there. And the important thing is that it be rigid and flat and easily fit on the area that you're going to sand. Now this has, between these two edges is a curved area and not a hard corner. I've got hard edges here and here, but I've got a nice rounded edge. So if I'm going to sand this, I don't want to just keep going back and forth in this, you know, on the same direction, because that'll create a flat, and I don't want to do that. So I might go around the edge. You kind of want to be careful with it because it's going to be really easy to flatten that out or change the shape or make it look weird. The important thing is that you're consistent with it and go around that edge. Now what about the hard corners? Well, you want to be careful with them, but they're actually a little bit easier, because really all you have to do is make sure that when you're sanding that you maintain that connection to this plane without wrapping over at all. So as long as you do that, you'll maintain this nice sharp edge. And with this, one of the things I like about working with the black filament is that you can easily see how your sanding is doing. You know, if you see this sort of part that's turned gray, well, that's the part that's getting sanded, and the part that is still black, that is the part that the sandpaper hasn't touched yet. So it's a good guide as to, you know, how you're doing. One thing I'm not going to do is this, no, I'm sorry, not that part, this part here, because that is going to butt up against this part eventually, and I need to glue that together, or fuse that together really. I'm not using glue, but we'll get to that later. All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish the rough sanding before moving on. So be back in a second. So as you can see, we've got a nice rough sand down. And if you look closely, you might see some areas like right there. You can see those kind of darker black areas. Right here, there's a couple, and there's a few across here. So some of the kind of divots formed by the different layers are going to be deeper than the others, and sometimes it's going to feel like, oh, I just can't get that out. And that's okay. Don't worry about it right now. Just get it as good as you think you can without doing too much work. This is probably 5 to 7 minutes of sanding at best. Probably more like 5 minutes. And I did scuff this up a little in preparation for joining these two pieces. Got sanded back there. I did the underside here. You know, these little curved areas are a little tougher, and you know, you kind of, well, there we go. You can kind of round off the sandpaper to get in there. Now keep in mind also that if you're doing something with a lot of fine detail, then it's going to be a lot more tough than this. Like for example, I've got this piece here. This has these areas in here with lots of little finicky detail, and while you can sand that, you don't want to go nuts on it because you don't want to lose some of that detail. And you got to be careful. And the white, wow, the white is so much harder to do this initial sanding on because you can't really see anything. So sometimes it's better even to start with a sort of a guide coat of primer. So you could lay down on this. I might even do black, but you could do gray as well. But just essentially something that is a different color. And actually with this one, I coated it with, this is all liquid green stuff from Citadel, which is essentially just a surface putty. And that sort of serves the same purpose so that when you're sanding, you can kind of just see how it's all going. And as you break through your guide coat, you can start seeing and feeling really the areas that you need to work on. This right here is, I think, oh no, this is my join between this piece and this piece. And I could feel that there's a little bump right there that will still need to get some work done to it. And there's another weird bump right there, and I think that is just because this piece is curved, and 3D printing doesn't do broad curves very well. It's all just steps, and you know, that is the most obvious view of the various steps involved in printing it, because this printed like this, essentially, you know, this is the bottom and this is the top, and so this is just a series of stair steps to make this curve right here, and you want to smooth all that out. And you can kind of see, because the putty stays in the recesses there, and you know, helps you smooth the whole thing out. And it doesn't all have to be sanding, but we'll get to the putty part later, because we will do that on this, just not very much because it doesn't need very much. All right, so that was the 120 sandpaper. I'm going to do the same thing with the 220 and then the 320. And I'm not going to waste your time showing you that because it's no different in any way than sanding it with the 120. And all that's going to happen is that when I move to the 220, it's just going to smooth it out a little bit more. And then when I move to the 320, it's going to smooth it out even more. And then we're going to be really close to the final smoothness, if you will, that is required. And then we'll talk about putty. So I'll come back in a minute with whatever the next step is going to be. All right, I've got this sanded about as well as I wanted to get sanded to this point. You can see it's actually got a little bit of a shine to it. But there's still some residual, you know, surface scratches from the 320 sandpaper, and you can see some areas where, you know, there's still some of those little lines left over. And some of you might go, that's good enough, and I've done that on occasion, but I really want to show you how to bring it all the way to awesome smoothness, which I've done for the most part on this piece. But in order to move on and do the next step, I kind of need to put this together. So I figured I'd show you that part. And this is a little challenging too, because it's got this weird U shape. And I'm noticing that the alignment of all of this is not going to be perfect. So getting this to look nice is going to be a little bit of a challenge. But I need to do... well, I need to get this tacked together a little bit first. And this is just a, you know, these just butt together. There's nothing else holding this. But I've found the best thing for ABS, and you can't do this with PLA, but with ABS, acetone makes a wonderful, well, you know, I want to say glue, but it's not really glue. Essentially, it's kind of welding the pieces together, because it's a solvent for the ABS. So it is essentially kind of dissolving the surface of both of these pieces, and it's turning the dissolved plastic into its own cement in a way, so that, you know, when you put that on both sides, let them get a little tacky and then stick them together, they're going to want to stay. See, it's already holding together. And it is a really good bond, I have discovered. And so what I'm doing now is I just want to check each of the surfaces and see if I can get a sense for what direction it might need to move in order to make it as smooth as possible, as smooth a transition as possible. Because there's still a little time here to kind of shift everything around if I need to, and this is not perfect right there. I'm going to put a little bit more acetone in to kind of dissolve the layer there. It should help me move this around if I need to. It also would then help bond it later. Oh, great. I got some on the back end. And that's all tacky. Well, that's going to need some more sanding. That feels not bad. That's a little off. I don't think I'm going to be able to get this much better than it is right now. Ooh, there's a little bit of a step there too. Well, I guess that's all going to just have to come out in the sanding, which is what this video is all about anyway, so that's okay. But now we have one piece. I'm going to lay in a little bit more acetone just to help with the bond. And put a little bit more on the outside here, because it's going to, capillary action will draw it into the middle. Since that's not a perfectly flat connection, the acetone is going to get sucked in. All right, and I'm going to let that cure out and then we'll come back. That's not going to be very long. All right, this is pretty well welded together here. I got an issue right here. It looks like there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, which means there should be one here, and there's not. So that's a little strange, but it's nice to know that this top is relatively straight. And the sides, at least this part, this angle, those seem to be good. So for some reason, there's just these two pieces are not aligned properly. So what I'm going to end up doing is, there's essentially two ways you can go with that. You can add material to this to try to bring that up, which is kind of dumb. The other probably easier way is to just sand this smooth, and I will get to that a little later. It's not really important, but I mean, for right now, for what I'm trying to show you, but I would just go back to my 120 grit, or in this case, since I do kind of want to take off a fair amount of material, I might actually go to a coarser grit. If I could find my 80 that I know is hanging around here somewhere, I might start with that, because really what I'm trying to do is remove about, I don't know, like a millimeter, maybe a little less, of material from both of these pieces. And so I really want to be careful when I do this not to rock over onto this side, because I don't really want to remove any material from this side. I just want to align the two. So I want to focus all of my sanding on this piece here until they are smooth. Oh, it's actually not taking long. And since I have two sides, I also want to pay attention to both of them, because if for some reason I apply more force to one side than the other, then one side could finish before the other, and then I start, making the two sides uneven. So that's just something else to be aware of. You might want to change your kind of perspective as you're sanding, just so that you know that you're not screwing that up. And that's already starting to get close, so that's actually not really a big problem at all. But I do need to go through then to all of these steps of the various sandpapers to get that to be correct. All right, but what about the rest of this? Because now I do have an area here that I need to correct. And I'm going to do that with this Bondo glazing and spot putty. And I've got this tool here. Actually, I may not use this one. I have this other one that has a little bit of an angle to it. It's also bigger. That might be better for this one. But essentially you just need some sort of spatula to apply it. Now this stuff is you just dispense it right out of the tube. It's if you decide you want to thin it, like if you wanted this to be smoother and thinner, then you can thin it down with acetone. And the reason you want your spatula here is because you want to spread it over an area and not just right on that edge, because you're gonna be blending the two pieces together. And I gotta be careful because I don't want to run it into this area here. It's already seen some some putty from when I was sanding just that piece alone. I don't know that there's going to be much of a way to... You know what I could have done before I did this is covered that with masking tape. All right. Oh, and a little excess needs to go in here, because you're kind of filling a gap right there. And then we're just going to do this all the way around. By the way, if you do thin this with acetone, just be aware that it shrinks a lot when you do that. So if you try to make this super smooth, let's say you're really trying to use your tool to blend it over so you have a minimum amount of sanding, it's going to shrink, and then it's not really going to cover the area like you thought it did. And you also want to be careful, because when you leave the cap off, this stuff dries really fast, and so it becomes hard to work with as it dries out. And it smells bad, and it's probably super bad for you to inhale, so keep that in mind. Yeah, this side seems to be worse. There's more of a step to it, so I think I'm going to want to make sure there's a fair amount of material here. You don't want to do it too thick no matter what. You might want to do multiple coats rather than a thick coat. A thick coat will take forever to dry. Thin coats dry super fast. All right, I think that's going to be good. We'll clear off that a little bit. See, this is already drying out. You can see how the color's changing, but you can also see that it's sort of shrinking into that gap. And we might do another coat of this before we get to sanding, but I need to let that dry before I do anything else, so we're going to do that. This probably going to want wait at least 15 minutes or so. And really, you just need to watch the colors. When the dark red all turns to this really light red, you could probably lay down another coat. All right, be back in a bit. You know what, as long as we're letting that dry, why don't I show you how this works when you thin it down. So I've got a little dollop of the putty. I got some acetone on a brush, and you just kind of use it like paint. And this is about as thin as you want it to get. You can go a little thinner than this, but then it just stops being useful. So there, you can see it's going to spread a little bit on its own. You get that all mixed up. There, that's good. And then I'm going to just paint it into here. And you can see how bad this is in terms of the kind of grittiness left over from the printing process. And you can see this is already kind of, you know, the acetone is already starting to evaporate from here. Now that's a little bit on the thin side, but that's okay. I'm kind of just treating this like a guide coat anyway. Now you also might ask about acetone smoothing. And that is an option if you're using ABS. And acetone smoothing is when you take your piece and you put it into a sealed container with some acetone, and you let the vapors from the acetone kind of do a surface smooth on your pieces. I've experimented with it, and I've definitely seen what other people are doing, and it can be pretty cool, but it's kind of a trade-off, because what's happening when you do that is you're going to lose some of your fine detail. It's going to kind of round everything off a bit, and it looks good for some things and doesn't look good for everything. And I prefer the controllability of sanding and puttying. In the end, the two things accomplish the same goals, but I don't necessarily like the finished look of the acetone smoothing for my props. Here, see, it's just like we painted that on. And of course that's going to fill it in, and then we can, you know, that's going to fill in the low points. We can go in with sandpaper. And of course, because of all of the fine detail in there and all the curviness, this is really just going in with a tiny piece of sandpaper and working it by hand and just being careful. There's no easy way to do it. There's no trick to it. It takes work and patience. So anyway, there we go. I'll come back when that other thing is finally dry, and we're on our way. It's getting there. All right, see you in a minute. So I ended up putting this on a little bit thicker than I probably should have, and it's taken a while for it to really cure out. I'm not even entirely sure that this is cured yet. I think it is, though. This was, and so I did a little sanding on it, and this, I just kind of checked on this to make sure. When you have gotten to the point where you think that the curing process is done, and you want to find out for sure, when you go into sand, if it starts to load up your sandpaper like this right away, then you know it's not fully cured yet. And I think I need another piece of paper. So when I'm doing the sanding for the putty, I start at 220. I don't go all the way back down to the 120. You want to be a little lighter handed with it. This stuff isn't super dense, and you know, it's really just meant there to smooth out the light stuff. If you have heavy, and I already mentioned this once, but I'm gonna mention it again. If you have like a heavy seam that you need to fill, like a huge gap or something, then Bondo, that the body filler putty, the kind that you get in a big tin, and it has a little hardener agent, and you mix the two together and then you spread that out. That stuff's really best for doing anything where you need to really either fill in a lot or really change a, like if this was really shifted up and I needed to add material, that would be better for that. As it is, this is annoyingly not as smooth as I'd like. So that's going to take a little extra work. But let's just go in right now and get some of this sanding. See, a little bit more of a light hand. And you can check your paper. That looks fine. You know, you just want to smooth it. You want it to feather out at the edges, kind of like that's doing there. If you go too hard, you could end up digging into it, and you don't want to do that. Whoops, and I have this around backwards. I want the smooth side down. There we go, that's better. And I need to stay on the within sight of the camera. That would always help. Ooh, that feels really good. Oh yeah, that's blending in really nicely there. And you know, if your sandpaper does start to load up, you can always just get a new piece or move to a different spot. As long as your sandpaper is nice and fresh, it'll do most of the work. You just kind of need to move your hand back and forth. Oh yeah, that's looking pretty good. Oh yeah, that's beautiful. And this is the area that's a little bit more problematic because of this little screw there that I don't want to sand down too much. It's raised up slightly above the surface there, and I don't want to sand it back down into it. So I just need to, you know, carefully sand around it. It's feeling pretty good. Got to do that curved corner here a bit. Looks like that needs a little more work to it. That might even need another pass on the yeah, you can kind of see that there's kind of a hard stop right there. Well, when we do some primer on it, that'll kind of tell us how bad it is and how much work we're going to need to do. Or I can just, you know, continue sanding it until we smooth it out. See how I'm moving that back and forth to keep the curve? It's getting better in the center. Not so much. Look at all that coming off of there. All right, I'm going to finish this up off camera, and then I'm going to lay down a coat of primer and we can get another look at it. So I'll be back in a minute. All right, we've got the primer down and we can take a look at how the surface looks. That's the nice part about doing the primer. And I can still see some scratching from the 220 sandpaper, and that's fine. And I can still see a little bit of the seam here that needs some filling and some sanding, and that's fine. And that's, I don't know how much better I'm going to be able to make this, but I'm, you know, that can get another pass. The problem is that there really is a bit of a step there that I can't do a lot with because of this screw. I guess ideally what I should do is put enough putty across here to raise this level up some. And again, this is back to one of those areas where I might even want to do Bondo, like surface it with some Bondo, because that actually provides more of a structural strength than the surface putty does. But otherwise, that looks really good. But you know what you don't see at all is you don't see any of the printing lines. None. There is not a single one left. So that's nice. The only thing left is just finishing off that seam. So that's it. And so at this point now, it's I'm going to move to, I'm going to sand a little bit more on this with the 320. And then lay down a little bit more primer and take another look, because that'll get rid of the surface scratching from the 220. And then make a final decision on, you know, how much puttying I want to do. And that's just more of that, more of the same. You know, it's more putty if needed, more sanding, more primer, until you get to a point where you're happy with it and you're like, that's going to look good enough. And the thing is, with the metal surfaces that I'm using on the gun, you really want it to be as perfect as possible. So, you know, there may be a fair amount of work before I'm happy enough with it, because I really do want to get rid of that line. And if I don't, it's going to be really visible on the final gun. And again, that one I might not be able to do much with, but, you know, we'll see in the end. And on the next video, I'll show you how it looks. But for now, I think that's going to do it. So thanks again for watching, and I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.